Hello everyone, welcome back to That's Entertainment. Today's countdown is a special one for all the retro fans out there who love to dig into the weird little differences that pop up between regions. We're diving into 10 NES games that looked or played very differently on the Famicom. That's right, some of your favorite childhood games weren't quite the same in Japan, and in some cases they were downright stranger, or better, or easier. Usually way easier. Let's jump into the 10 biggest changes we saw between the NES and Famicom versions of classic games. I certainly have a lot of love for the Final Fantasy series. Heck, the North American release of the first game was on my birthday. But for a while there were certain gaps in the games that we had access to. While American players were introduced to the Final Fantasy series through the original NES game in 1990, Japan had already moved on to Final Fantasy II on the Famicom. And this sequel was very different. Unlike the level-based progression of the original, Final Fantasy II introduced a new system where characters improved stats based on what they did in battle. Swing swords to get stronger, take hits to raise HP, and so on. It was experimental and divisive, and Square ultimately decided not to localize it for the NES at all. Instead, they skipped Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy III entirely on the NES, jumping to Final Fantasy IV on the SNES, which was renamed Final Fantasy II in the West to maintain continuity. This odd jump caused years of confusion and delayed players from experiencing the true evolution of the series. We were also left out in the cold from the series' first appearance of things like chocobos. This was a perfect example of how localization decisions shaped the way Western audiences perceived entire franchises. In Japan, Final Fantasy II was bold, weird, and forward-thinking. In the US, it was just a ghost, lost until the PlayStation 1 and Game Boy Advance re-releases many years later. Loadrunner might not be the flashiest NES game, but it's got an interesting quirk when comparing it to its Famicom counterpart. Both versions included a level editor, pretty advanced for the time, but there was one major difference: the ability to save your custom stages. On the Famicom, players could use the Famicom data recorder to save their creations for future play sessions. On the NES, though, the editor was more of a novelty. Your levels were lost the moment you turned the power off. This was also something players would experience in Excitebike. While the feature was technically present, it didn't have nearly the same utility. It's a great example of how hardware differences between regions could directly affect how much you could get out of a game. Zelda II stands out as one of the most distinct entries in the Legend of Zelda series, and its differences between the Famicom and NES versions are particularly noteworthy. The Famicom version allowed for features like saving progress directly to the disc. Conversely, the NES version utilized battery-backed cartridges for saving. The Famicom version featured unique audio elements, such as alternate battle music and different sound effects when text appeared, or when Link took damage. Additionally, the Japanese version had animated water in the overworld and different enemy sprites on the map. The Famicom version was generally more challenging, with enemies dealing more damage and Link having fewer lives. The NES version adjusted these aspects to make the game more accessible to Western audiences. At number 7 we have Metroid, a landmark title in the action-adventure genre. The Famicom Disk System version of Metroid includes a save feature, allowing players to save their progress, an important luxury for such a tough game. Meanwhile, the NES version lacked this feature, requiring players to use passwords to continue, making it much more difficult to complete. Another difference comes in the sound design. The Famicom version benefited from the Disk System's enhanced audio capabilities, offering richer sound effects and music. The NES version had simpler, more repetitive sound due to its limited audio channels. This resulted in a more atmospheric experience on the Famicom, while the NES version was a bit more basic. These differences highlighted how hardware affected gameplay experiences. The save system in the Famicom version made the game more manageable, while the difficult password system on the NES created a more challenging experience. It likely also kept production costs down at the time, because the only alternative would have been a battery-backed RAM, like Zelda I and Zelda II had. Maniac Mansion, originally developed for the Commodore 64 by Lucasfilm Games in 1987, was a cult hit full of quirky humor, multiple story paths, and some surprisingly edgy content for its time. But things got really interesting when the game made its way to Nintendo consoles. In 1988, Jaleco released a version of Maniac Mansion for the Famicom in Japan. This version looked and sounded wildly different than its Western computer counterpart. The graphics were heavily altered, the sound design was completely redone, and the overall vibe felt, well, off compared to the original. It was Maniac Mansion in name, but not really in spirit. That changed when Lucasfilm Games collaborated with Real Time Associates in 1990 to create an entirely new version for the NES. This wasn't just a localization, it was a reboot of the console port built from the ground up to be more faithful to the original computer experience. Despite Nintendo of America's strict content guidelines, which meant no microwaving hamsters, the NES version preserved the core gameplay, story structure, and much of the humor, with an interface that worked surprisingly well on a gamepad. In a way, Maniac Mansion on NES is a rare example of a do-over done right. It shows how a Western developer went the extra mile to bring their vision to life on limited hardware, and how a second chance can make all the difference. When Dragon Quest made its way to the West, it didn't come quietly. It came with a complete translation, updated graphics, and even gameplay tweaks. Renamed Dragon Warrior for the NES, the game featured a new UI, more polished sprites, and a whole rewritten script that leaned hard into medieval English. "Thou hast done well to smite thine foe." But the most important change? The grind was smoothed out. The NES version was rebalanced to make leveling and progression feel less tedious. It's another case of folks at the time thinking that those in the West needed a bit of a softer experience. If you played Ninja Gaiden 3 on the NES and thought it was brutally unfair, you're not wrong. The Famicom version, titled Ninja Ryukenden 3, was a much more forgiving experience. When Tecmo localized the game for North America, they made several changes that amped up the difficulty, and not in subtle ways. For starters, the NES version removed the password system that existed in the Famicom release, meaning players had to beat the entire game in a single sitting. On top of that, enemies dealt double damage compared to the Japanese version. Extra lives and power-ups were also less frequent, turning an already tough platformer into an exercise in frustration. Even continues were limited. This was one of those rare cases where the game was actually harder in the West. We had been trained to like slightly easier games than our Eastern counterparts, after all. In the case of Ninja Gaiden 3, it wasn't just harder, it was practically a different beast. In Japan, the Famicom version of Contra was enhanced thanks to the Famicom Disk System. Konami also used their own in-house cartridge and mapper, which gave them more flexibility. The game had cutscenes, an actual opening cinematic, and better background effects, like swaying leaves, animated waterfalls, snow, and even pulsating organics in the alien lair. On the NES, all that was cut to fit on a cartridge. The result is a leaner experience. Still fun, still iconic, but missing the flair. The Japanese release was harder, starting off at the harder gameplay loop right from the get-go. If you wanted to experience that on the NES, you had to beat the game once first. As a bit of bonus trivia, Contra released with another coat of paint as Probotector in Europe, due to censorship laws. In Japan, Super Mario Bros. 2 was a direct sequel to the original game. Same engine, same graphics, but wildly more difficult. You might know it as the Lost Levels. They threw in tricky wind physics, poison mushrooms, and levels designed to trick you, not help you. Nintendo of America took one look at it and said, nope. So instead, we got Doki Doki Panic, rebranded as Super Mario Bros. 2 for the West. It was colorful, it had different characters with unique abilities, and it was a whole new gameplay style. That version eventually became canon, with Shy Guys and Bob-ombs joining the Mario universe. So in this case, we didn't get a harder or easier version. We got a completely different game. Most games on the NES started their lives in Japan before making their way overseas, but Star Tropics flipped the script. This quirky, tropical-themed adventure game was developed exclusively for Western audiences by Nintendo's R&D 3 team, the same group behind Punch-Out! There was no Japanese Famicom version of the game at all. Instead, Star Tropics was designed from the ground up to appeal to American kids, featuring baseball bats instead of swords, aliens instead of dragons, and a Hawaiian-inspired island setting. It even came with a real-life, physical letter from your in-game uncle, one you were supposed to dip in water to reveal a secret code. That kind of immersive marketing was completely absent in Japan. It's the inverse of something like Final Fantasy II, which skipped a Western release for decades, and it's why we put this last on our list. Star Tropics is a case where Nintendo looked outward instead of inward, an experimental, Western-first approach that rarely happened at the time. It may not have had the franchise legs of Zelda or Metroid, but it's a unique artifact of how game development was evolving during the NES era. As we've seen today, the differences between the NES and Famicom versions of these classic games go far beyond just language translation. From visual overhauls and cut content to full-on gameplay reworks and difficulty spikes, developers often tailored their games dramatically for different audiences, and not always in the way you'd expect. If you enjoyed this dive into regional differences, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And let me know in the comments, which NES Famicom differences surprised you the most? Or are there others I missed that deserve their own spotlight? Until next time, this is Mike with That's Entertainment signing off, and reminding you, sometimes the biggest boss is the localization team. Check out our review for Arcade Paradise. It's a very fun, retro-heavy game. If you're into D&D, you can also check out our sister channel, Tellist, where we have plenty of maps on display. And we'll also be refreshing this channel with new retro reviews, so keep an eye out.